have noticed on the front of your bulletin, or on the image that is up on the wall, we have begun a new sermon series. We have started to move from this question of who is our neighbor and into exploring God's grace for us, and how when we are able to answer that question of who is our neighbor, we are able to live into God's grace in new and incredible ways. And so for the next couple of weeks, we will be exploring God's grace. And if you remember back, those of you that were maybe confirmed in the Methodist Church, or did a lot of Sunday school as a kid in the Methodist Church, or maybe you just know your Methodist words really well, you might remember that John Wesley, who is more or less the founder of the Methodists, believed that there were three different types of grace: prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. And so the next couple of weeks, we are going to unpack these words. And these three different types of grace are really something that makes us as Methodists really unique, because other denominations don't really define grace in these ways. They don't really see it as different types, but just that God has grace for us. But this first type of grace, prevenient grace, is by far my favorite. And so when we were working out the sermon preaching schedule, I was really excited that I got to preach on prevenient grace, because it's this type of grace that I really don't understand. And it's this type of grace that is really counterintuitive to how we live our lives and how we go about our day-to-day. You see, prevenient grace says that God has grace or love and forgiveness, or as confirmands 2 classes ago described it, good vibes from God, are given to us long before we ever say yes to God. That there is nothing that we can do to earn this grace, and there's nothing that we can do to lose this grace. John Wesley believed that God pursues us long before we have any concept of who God is. And maybe it's because this is one of my favorite types of grace that it is rubbed off on our confirmation classes in this way. But I texted one of our youth last night to say, hey, I'm preaching on grace. Do you want to preach instead? Because one confirmand in particular this year really caught the notion of prevenient grace, and did so in such a way that she has used it to once or twice backtalk her parents. She's done something and then said, parent has gotten mad and said, you need to do this different. And she said, but God loves me anyway. I can't earn God's grace. It's okay. You should forgive me too. Not really how I intended for prevenient grace to be lived out in their lives, but hey, she gets it. And she even used the word prevenient grace when talking to her mom. Her mom texted me on a Saturday night at about 9 and said, guess what just happened? And I said, look, actually that just made my night. You see, it's this grace that we do nothing to earn. And it's, like I said, it's so counterintuitive, because when we go to work, we are trying to earn a paycheck. When we build relationships, we are trying to earn one another's trust or love. When we start competing in sports, we are trying to earn that gold medal or that fastest time, right? We are taught, at least I was taught from a young age, that nothing is going to just be given to you, right? That you have to work for everything that you receive. And yet grace, this prevenient grace, is given to us before we do or say anything. In Ephesians, which was read for you this morning, I think it's particularly highlighted in verse 8, where it says, "For grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not of your own doing, but it is a gift from God, not the result of works, so that one may boast. Grace is a gift from God. It is a gift from God that we do not earn and that we do not deserve, and yet it is given. And it is given from our Creator who knows us so well, which is why the psalm that was read was paired with this teaching on grace. Psalm 139, the psalmist knows that God has created them. The psalmist trusts that they were created by this Creator who has known them from the beginning. Right? "O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up." The psalmist goes on to write about all of the things that God knows about them, and that God calls them fearfully and wonderfully made. God knows all about us. God knows your best and your worst moments in life. And yet God calls you fearfully and wonderfully made. God's grace and love and forgiveness is given and poured out, even though our Creator knows us. I think about some of those moments that I am really ashamed of. Those moments when I said something that immediately as it came out of my mouth I regretted. Or that moment that I sat silent and I wish that I had had the courage to speak. I think about times when I acted too soon or I didn't act fast enough. And yet God knows all of that, and yet still calls me beloved, and still calls each of us beloved. If anyone could call us the furthest thing from beloved, it is God. And yet we are called good. We are told that we were made in the image of God and that God loves us no matter what. And that God loves all of us, right? That God doesn't just love you or me or the people that we have an easy time loving, but that God loves everyone. The letter that was written to the Ephesians, there's this huge emphasis throughout the letter that there is no longer separation between Jew or Gentile. These two groups of people that were fighting over who had the right to the resurrection, who was saved through the resurrection, which group had been living the right way. These two groups of people thought very little of each other. And yet Ephesians says there are no longer any barriers. And not only are there no more barriers, but Christ, through his death and resurrection, has united both Jew and Gentile. Many of the epistles, the letters in the New Testament, write a lot about what to do when Jesus comes back. A lot of discussion about when Jesus was going to come back, because for the first century audience, they thought that Jesus was coming back in their lifetime. And so it was all about preparing to live so that when Jesus came back, that they would go to heaven. But in Ephesians, the emphasis changes. And it becomes about how to live your life now because of the resurrection that you believe in. Not that what happens next was the most important, but that your day-to-day living should be transformed because you are able to trust that God loves you and that Christ has come for you. You see, it doesn't begin with celebrating anything about us, but it begins with celebrating in who our God is. And that trusting that in who our God is, that God has created us in that image for goodness. It's not because of who we are. And sometimes I have a really hard time trusting in that. Right? But there is nothing that you can do or say to make God love you any more or love you any less. There is nothing that you can do or say to make God love you any more or any less. I don't get it. It doesn't make any kind of sense in my brain, but it makes sense in my heart. And it makes sense in the things and the ways that I have witnessed God in the world. Trusting in that grace and that love brings a fullness of joy and a fullness of peace, even in the midst of despair and of question. And I don't get it. But it is a beautiful, beautiful gift. And it is a gift that each of us are given, no matter where you are on this journey. Whether you have said yes to God and you have been living into that yes from that day, whether you have said yes to God and then no to God and then yes and then no and then yes and then no, whether you are still asking those first questions of is this real and can I believe this, wherever you are on this journey, God loves you. And God calls you beloved, and God created you and pours out grace upon you. In the next few weeks, we are going to look more at what living into that grace looks like. But for now, it's about celebrating that long before we said yes, long before we did or said anything that we would see worthy in the eyes of God, that God already called us beloved. And so my prayer for you this week is that you would be able to live into that joy a little more fully. And that you would be able to share that joy with those around you. That you would trust that you are God's beloved. And that God calls you good. Amen.